And we're good.
Okay, fantastic. All right, well, good morning, everybody. Welcome to those who are also watching on the YouTube. So let us dive straight in. So we're going to start with, whoops, let's see if this is going to work. Okay, great. So we'll start with a definition of what we mean by metacognition. So by cognition, broadly construed, we mean some kind of internal process that transforms inputs into outputs. So making a decision based on some stimulus or retrieving information from memory. And by metacognition, very simply, we mean the capacity to think about and reflect upon other cognitive processes. So metacognition has this recursive aspect to it, and it's been linked to aspects of conscious experience such as self-reflection, recursive thought, and so on. And we heard in the beautiful talk at the start of the summer school from Matthias about the history of consciousness science, and there's a strand of metacognition research really running through experimental psychology from the beginning of the field. So you can think of actually the birth of modern experimental psychology from the tradition set up by Wundt and Titchener in the 19th century as really being a focus on metacognition. So in this hefty manual of laboratory practice from Titchener, he required his subjects in his studies to have practice at carrying out over 10,000 introspective judgments. So they wanted people who were excellent at introspection, and they really just recorded what people thought about their own mental impressions, their own sensory impressions. But these early pioneers of what we now think of as metacognition or introspection research were hit by something that we also think of as quite a modern phenomenon. So they were hit by a replication crisis. And effectively, the problem was that introspective judgments about what people were thinking or feeling were varying from moment to moment and from observer to observer. And from what we now know about the unreliability or variability in metacognition, this is not so surprising, but they didn't really have the analysis tools available to kind of fit their data into that kind of framework. And so people like Wundt, who really kind of kick-started this movement, eventually disowned it. So saying here, all accurate observation implies that the observed object is independent of the observer. And so as is now famous, there's kind of this tension between behaviorism on the one end and introspectionism on the other end, and this pendulum swung back and forth through the 20th century with papers debating to what extent should we rely on self-reports about what people say about what's going on in their own minds. And I think now, at least since the 1980s, we're in a kind of golden era of metacognition research, because the idea is that we don't ignore what people say about what's going on in their minds, but we also don't treat it as gospel. We don't treat it as a data point about their psychology. And instead, we treat metacognitive judgments as beliefs that people hold about their cognitive processes, so how confident they feel about particular decisions and so on. And then we see if we can try and quantify the accuracy of those beliefs. So that's what I like to call skeptical introspectionism. So I won't go too much into the details of how we measure metacognition. This is what Marion is going to talk about in much more detail. But the key idea is to take metacognitive judgments about behavior, about performance seriously, and then try and quantify the link between the two. And just one concept that is important to introduce is this idea of metacognitive sensitivity. So this is the idea that once we have plenty of data about your judgments of your own performance in various tasks, we can start building up a picture of the statistical association between behavior and metacognitive judgments. So if you have high confidence when you're right and lower confidence when you're wrong, then intuitively you can be ascribed a higher degree of metacognitive insight or metacognitive sensitivity. And so approaches such as this one, and this framework for measuring metacognition as the association between judgments of performance and performance itself, has meant that confidence has also become a core variable of interest for metacognition research. And that's because this kind of relatively broad idea of human metacognition is understanding how that works in general is obviously quite a complex and multifaceted question. But studying the processes that support the formation of confidence in perception, action, and cognition is perhaps easier to get a grasp of. So what I want to do is just briefly give a very brief, too brief really, a historical overview of initial work on individual differences in metacognition, because that lays the groundwork for what I want to talk about in the remainder of the talk, which is, as I said, how metacognition operates across different domains of perception and cognition. So following the development of these kinds of analysis methods in the 80s and 90s, the first wave of studies in cognitive neuroscience is really focused on the structural and functional basis of individual differences in metacognition. So what makes one person's metacognition better than another's? And there's been particular focus on the role of the prefrontal cortex here, as it's long been known from clinical observation that damage to the prefrontal cortex often results in deficits in self-awareness or insight. And so one of the first studies of the neuropsychology of metacognition, this is from Art Shimomura and Larry Squire, this really kind of provided some of the first evidence that this idea of prefrontal cortex supporting self-awareness or metacognitive insight was along the right lines. And so this was a somewhat complicated study with lots of different groups, but I just want to highlight the key result really, which is when they compared memory performance, so performance on a simple recognition memory task between a group of patients with Korsakoff syndrome and a group of patients with classical amnesia, these 4 cases here, they found that these 2 groups were well matched for performance, but the Korsakoff group was effectively a chance in their metacognitive sensitivity. So the Korsakoff group had impaired awareness of whether they were going to be right or wrong on any individual trial. So why might that be? Well, we know they didn't have brain imaging in this study, but we know from other studies of Korsakoff syndrome that there's often damage to the frontal lobes. And since then, there's been many studies that supported this idea that if you have a prefrontal lesion, then in careful tests in the lab, you might exhibit deficits in metacognition as quantified by this association between task performance and confidence. And so more recently, there's been studies also in healthy control. So this is one study that I did towards the end of my PhD at UCL, where we quantified individual differences in metacognition on a simple perceptual task. So this was a contrast discrimination task followed by a confidence rating. And we used staircase procedures to match performance across individuals on the perceptual component of the task. But we still noticed that there were plenty of variability left over, if you like, in the metacognitive sensitivity. That's in the red triangle, the red diamonds here. So performance is well matched, the blue triangles, but there's wide variation in metacognitive sensitivity. And this is a measure known as the area under the type 2 REC. So Marion will mention more about what that means later. And so intuitively, what this means is that the guys on the right-hand side of the graph here, they have good awareness or good insight into whether they're right or wrong on any individual trial. But the guys on the left-hand side of the graph here have poor metacognition about their performance. And we found, to cut a long story short, that these individual differences in metacognition were related to subtle differences in grey matter volume in the anterior prefrontal cortex, and also in white matter integrity, as measured by fractional anisotropy, in the corpus callosum in areas of white matter that we know anatomically are also projecting to the anterior prefrontal cortex. So the story has got a little bit more complicated since then, but a general message from this kind of first wave of individual difference studies is that there's substantial variation in metacognitive ability on simple tasks, even in healthy subjects. And B, this is often, studies have found that this variability is predicted by individual differences in anterior prefrontal cortex structure and function. And this perhaps makes sense post hoc, if you like, anatomically, because we know from other work that the anterior portions of the prefrontal cortex are at the top of a cognitive hierarchy. It acts as you can see in the figure in the bottom right here, it acts as a convergence zone for inputs from other prefrontal regions. And interestingly, it seems to be much less well developed in non-human primates. So these initial findings have kind of set the stage for a lot of work that we do in our lab and also other labs to try and understand the contribution of these prefrontal subregions to metacognitive capacity. So I mentioned that was a relatively whistle-stop tour of kind of first wave of individual difference studies. What I want to focus on in the remainder of the talk is this issue of domain generality. And I think this has interesting relationships to what Patrick was talking about on day one, which is this idea of to what extent does metacognition know about or has information about the sensory or cognitive domain that it is monitoring. So do we have a kind of general metacognitive resource that we apply to all different types of tasks that we engage in, both in the lab and in daily life, or is metacognition itself more domain specific? So one way to start answering that question is to ask whether there are shared individual differences across different tasks. So to put it simply, does having good metacognition on task 1 predict good metacognition on task 2? And so this is an early attempt to try and answer that question, work carried out by Chen Song in Geraint Rees's lab. And what she did was basically take the task that we had used in that study of brain structure that I mentioned just previously, and added on a second task to it, where now, rather than contrast discrimination, the first order task was orientation discrimination. So you had to say which of these two intervals contained a orientation pop out, and also then rate your confidence in that decision. And what we found was that, and this was the reason for using contrast and orientation in this study, was that we know from other work that these two perceptual sensitivities tend to be uncorrelated across subjects. So just being good at contrast discrimination doesn't necessarily make you good at orientation discrimination. And that's exactly what we saw. So the performance thresholds for the two tasks were uncorrelated across subjects. However, when we then looked at the metacognition data, when we looked at the confidence ratings, we found there were significant correlations in both overall confidence level, so what we call metacognitive bias, and also metacognitive sensitivity across the two tasks. So even though your performance on the first order tasks were uncorrelated, your metacognitive sensitivity on the two tasks was correlated. Now, there are obviously some shortcomings of this study. So first of all, there's only 18 subjects, not great for doing correlation analyses. Second of all, these are two very similar perceptual tasks. So perhaps all this is telling us is that there's a kind of visual metacognition capacity, but it doesn't really transfer across other more distant domains. So there's now been quite a lot of these kinds of studies looking at correlations in metacognitive sensitivity across a range of different tasks. And a couple of years ago, Marion Rouault, when she was in my lab, then we looked at we put together a meta-analysis of these correlation coefficients across the different studies, and looked for evidence of systematic domain generality between different types of tasks. And what we found was that for different perceptual tasks, so like the one I just described about the two different visual tasks, there was good evidence for cross-task correlations in metacognitive sensitivity. So the meta-analytic correlation coefficient was about 0.5. But when we looked across more distant tasks, so correlations between metacognition about a memory task and metacognition about a perception task, now the correlation coefficient is not significantly different from 0. And so what we kind of concluded in this paper was that there was some evidence of domain generality, but it was a bit equivocal. The literature was a bit equivocal in terms of more distant cross-task correlations. And one problem with this is that each of these individual studies, a bit like the one I described before, was reliant on relatively small subject numbers. So it's possible that there are substantial domain general components, but they're just being masked by low-powered studies. And so, as partly in response to this, we were able to, in collaboration with Audrey Mazantier, who visited the lab for a summer a couple of years ago, we were able to look at a bigger number of subjects. So this is now 181 subjects who performed 4 different metacognitive tasks. And so we had a recognition memory task, a general knowledge task, a perceptual task, and also a kind of executive function style task. And importantly, after every single judgment in all of the 4 tasks, subjects gave this graded confidence rating. So that allowed us to compute for every task subjects' metacognitive sensitivity. Now, what we found was that and I'm just going to jump straight to the results. I'm not going to talk so much about the analysis here. This is using actually the hierarchical meta D prime toolbox that Mariam will talk about and you'll be able to work with later on this afternoon. And effectively what this is doing is modeling the covariance matrix that relates metacognitive performance on each of the 4 tasks, and then looking for the extent to which these correlation parameters in that covariance matrix, so these row parameters, deviate from 0. If they deviate from 0, that's evidence for some cross-task correlation. And what we found is that for most of the task pairs, there was indeed a domain general component to metacognitive sensitivity. So when we have these bigger data sets of subjects who are all performing the same kind of tasks, then we do see evidence for a domain general component. And importantly, this is not due to the performance itself being correlated across the 2 tasks, because we can find pairs of tasks where % correct on the 2 tasks is uncorrelated, but metacognitive sensitivity is still correlated. And then just one other piece of behavioral evidence in favor of some aspects of domain generality and metacognition is this work that Jason Carpenter carried out a couple of years ago. So what he did was look at the extent to which, if you are trained to improve your metacognition on one task, does that transfer to a novel domain that you've never been trained on? And that's exactly what he found. So I don't have time to go into all the details of the training procedure, but what he effectively found, and apologies for the slightly complex figure, this is a latent change score model. So what this is showing is that in the perceptual task, after training at time point 2, we see a significant increase in the perceptual metacognitive sensitivity, but we also see an increase in memory metacognition, even though they'd never been trained on the memory metacognition task. And that wasn't the case for a control group who didn't receive metacognitive training. So that again suggests that, the extent to which we can train metacognition in a domain general way, that suggests that there must be some kind of shared resource underpinning the 2 tasks. Now, what that is and how it works, we're not really sure yet, but it does at least add to the evidence for a domain general component to metacognitive sensitivity. And then a final perspective on domain generality can be provided by looking at the neural encoding of confidence. So it was interesting to hear about how you got on in the adversarial collaborations, thinking along the lines of designing new experiments to kind of tease apart different contributors to the neural basis of confidence. Again, I don't have much time to go into all of this, but this is work from Dan Bang in my group. And what he's been able to do is start unpacking different neurocomputational contributions to a neural representation of confidence. And what we've effectively found is that there are multiple components that seem to influence an integrated confidence representation. So perceptual uncertainty, for instance, is tracked both by fluctuations in neurotransmitter levels and fluctuations in visual and parietal activations. But importantly for the current talk, what we see is that it's not until you get to these medial prefrontal regions that you see a more integrated representation of subjective confidence that seems to take in account of all of these factors and track confidence from trial to trial. So I think that potentially shed some light on this debate between first order and second order models of confidence formation that we were talking about the other day. It's not that they are opposed to each other necessarily, but maybe they're just trying to explain different things. So first order models of confidence typically focus on representations of perceptual uncertainty. And that's what we find in this study tracked in the parietal cortex, and this study tracked by serotonin fluctuations. But second order models are focused more on this kind of integrated representation of confidence that's informed by perceptual uncertainty and also other factors such as the difficulty of the decision, your response time, and so on. And so what Dan found in that particular study was that if we built a model of fluctuations in subjective confidence that take into account all these different predictors, then there was really just one region that was tightly coupled in terms of its univariate Bold signal to fluctuations in subjective confidence, and that was this medial prefrontal region, the perigenual anterior cingulate cortex. So to return to the issue of domain generality, we can then ask, well, does the signal in this region care about the kind of task you're doing? Right? Does it matter whether you're doing a memory task or a perceptual task, and so on? And one way to address that question is to use cross-classification analyses of use machine learning methods to fit a classifier to predict your confidence in one task, and ask whether the classifier, having been trained on the perceptual task, for instance, can transfer and predict confidence in the other task. If it can do, then that's evidence for a domain general confidence code. Whereas if it can only predict confidence within a task, but not transfer across tasks, that's evidence for a more domain specific confidence code. And so in this study from Jorge Morales, what he did was do exactly this in performance matched perceptual and memory tasks. And what he found when we looked at using a whole brain searchlight analysis for both the cross classification, so the domain general confidence code, but also the domain specific confidence code, what he found was that this region of perigenial anterior cingulate, so this kind of ventromedial prefrontal region close to the corpus callosum, that showed clear evidence of a domain general confidence code. So the activation here, the pattern of activation here tracks confidence, but it doesn't seem to matter whether you're doing a memory task or a perceptual task, you're still going to get a fairly generic confidence signal in that region. Interestingly, and I'll come back to this, there was evidence for a more domain-specific code in the lateral frontopolar cortex. So that's this, particularly on the right side here, in this ROI analysis. So what the signal in this region is doing is we're able to decode confidence, but we can only do it in a way that is specific to that particular task. If you decode confidence on the perceptual task and try and then use that trained classifier to predict confidence on the memory task, that's not going to be possible in the lateral frontopolar cortex, according to these data. Okay, so kind of the current perspective, at least my current perspective on domain generality, is that behaviorally we now have reasonably good evidence for a domain general component to metacognition. We don't really understand why that is. There's lots of reasons for that. Perhaps it's just the way people use the confidence scale, for instance, or the way they are able to form these kind of reports. So there's lots of work still to do to understand what is it about this domain general component that enables people to transfer, for instance, their training across tasks. And you know, computationally, I think this suggests that, you know, the monitoring of some task-independent signals, so for instance, motor-related signals that are common to all different tasks, might support these more generic confidence signatures. As we just mentioned, so neurally, domain generality may be supported by more generic confidence signals observed in medial prefrontal cortex. There's also really nice recent evidence from rodents as well, from Adam Kapex's group, that suggests single neurons in the rodent OFC are also carrying a domain general confidence code that generalizes across two different tasks. And functionally, why might it be there? Well, we think that one useful reason to have a more domain general confidence code is that it facilitates this kind of generalization of confidence across different tasks. So if I know that I'm confident, you know, in performing task A, if that's relatively similar to task B, that will enable me to quickly form a metacognitive estimate of how likely I am to do on that other task. And that's been shown nicely behaviorally by Vincent de Gardel and Pascal Mamassian. So, you know, that's kind of the evidence for domain generality, if you like. But what I want to finish up with is just by pointing out some evidence, so highlighting some evidence that doesn't fit this pattern. And, you know, sometimes you can kind of just dismiss that as saying, well, maybe the weight of evidence is now more on the domain general side, so we should kind of not place too much weight on studies that are showing dissociations. But I think there's actually some fairly systematic dissociations that are in the literature, and that particularly there seem to be systematic dissociations with respect to perceptual metacognition. And this might offer us a route towards understanding the intersection of metacognition and perceptual awareness, something that Matthias referred to as being important for the future of consciousness science in his talk on Monday. So we've already talked about different kinds of metacognition. So, you can think of meta memory as being reflecting on to what extent I have knowledge about a particular topic, whereas meta perception is reflecting on the extent to which we have, good quality perceptual information. To what extent do I feel confident in simple perceptual discrimination, simple perceptual choices? So there's been some argument that meta perception seems inherently linked to assessing the quality of our experience. So this seems interestingly linked to higher order approaches to consciousness, this idea that inherent to perceptual awareness is the capacity to be aware of or monitor a first order perceptual representation. So one idea then is comparing these different types of metacognition might give us a route towards understanding what's special, if anything, about perceptual metacognition. So one of the first studies that found dissociations between these two types of metacognition was this one from Hak-van Lau's group, from McCurdy et al. A few years ago now. And what they did was ask a group of otherwise healthy subjects to carry out both a perceptual metacognition task and also a memory metacognition task. And they then computed for each subject both their first order performance on the two tasks and also their metacognitive sensitivity. And I'll just show you the key result. This was also a study of individual differences in brain structure. And what they found was that perceptual metacognition was correlated with grey matter volume in the anterior prefrontal cortex. So that's replicating our earlier result using a very similar task. But perhaps surprisingly, memory metacognition was now correlated not with anterior prefrontal volume, but with grey matter variation in the medial parietal cortex. And something similar was found in this study published in the same year, same journal, by Benjamin Baird, but now using resting state fMRI as their dependent variable. And what they found was that resting state connectivity between this same region of medial parietal cortex, precuneus, and prefrontal cortex predicted memory metacognition, whereas it was connectivity between the dorsal anterior cingulate and the lateral frontopolar cortex that predicted individual variation in perceptual metacognition. So this hints at some interesting dissociation. So, what might be going on here? Well, so one added data point to this is this study that we carried out inspired by these two papers, the McCurdy and Baird papers. And so we were interested in searching for the possibility of dissociations in metacognition between distinct domains. So together with Karen Blackman, when I was a postdoc at NYU, we recruited subjects who had these relatively rare lesions following tumor resection to the anterior prefrontal cortex. So the subjects were recruited into the study if their anatomical lesion overlapped with anatomically defined Brodmann area 10, so these medial and lateral frontopolar regions. So clearly the lesion overlap map, the lesions are messy, some of the lesions extended further back in the brain, but all the subjects in this particular group had overlap with area 10. And we had 7 of these anterior prefrontal patients. We also had a lesion control group, so subjects with temporal lobe lesions of a comparable size. So we didn't expect the temporal lobe to have any particular involvement in metacognition. So this provides a nice control group, and also a group of age-matched healthy controls. And the nice thing about, I think one of the nice things about this set of subjects is that they're all matched for IQ, for lots of different neuropsychological factors, such as working memory, their age, the lesion volume for the two control groups, and so on. The only thing that was not perfectly matched was verbal memory, where the temporal lobe group actually had a slightly lower verbal memory, but that's to be expected, and we didn't think that would affect our analyses of metacognition. And so very simply, we just asked the subjects to carry out very similar tasks to the ones in that McCurdy study, both of to quantify perceptual metacognition and memory metacognition. And what we found was that, first of all, there were no differences in first order performance, so percent correct on the perception or memory tasks across 3 different groups. We also use a staircase procedure in the perceptual task and to match performance. But when we looked at the staircase parameter itself, so how difficult we had to make the task to get that group of subjects to perform around the same level, we also didn't see any significant differences there. So all the groups seem relatively well matched in first order performance. And when we also look at just average confidence, so this metacognitive bias metric, we also don't see any significant differences. So, these groups of subjects, they're high performing, they come into the lab, they're doing the task, they're performing well, they're confident, and so on. But what was pretty striking is that when we computed their metacognitive sensitivity, or this is this meta d prime over d prime metric that you'll hear about more from Marion, what we see is that there's a striking drop, almost a 50% drop in metacognitive efficiency in the aPFC lesion group on the perceptual task that we don't see in either of the two control groups. But interestingly, this drop was specific to the perceptual task. We did not see that difference in the memory task. So there seemed to be, in this aPFC lesion group, it's a small group of patients, but this is a fairly systematic dissociation. There was a impairment on perceptual metacognition, but not on memory metacognition. So that leads to a significant group by task interaction. So the kind of conclusion from this study, and this obviously kind of goes somewhat in line with those data from the McCurdy and Baird study, suggesting that what matters perhaps more for memory metacognition is the integrity of the more posterior regions, the parietal cortex. This also potentially is consistent with these findings from the Morales study that while there might be midline regions that carry a more generic confidence code, perhaps you need these anterior prefrontal regions for domain-specific metacognition, particularly for perception. And there's also interesting connections. This is now kind of turning to connections to the consciousness literature. This is a study from Stan Dehaen's group. And when they looked at patients who also had prefrontal damage, they found that there were differences in subjective visibility in a perceptual task between the patients and controls. And when they correlated the difference here in subjective visibility, so what they called the consciousness threshold here, when they correlated that with individual variation in the lesion location, what they found was that the peak correlation between consciousness threshold and lesion location was indeed in this fairly similar region of anterior lateral prefrontal cortex. So what might be going on here? So one way to start thinking about what might be going on here is to focus in on what is it about perceptual metacognition that might be different from memory metacognition. So, we're not claiming that this region is kind of a module for perceptual awareness or a module for perceptual metacognition, but perhaps it's contributing to the computation here in a manner that's not really needed for solving the memory metacognition task. So one potential insight, and there's lots of possibilities here, we don't really fully understand this, but one potential insight is that perceptual confidence seems to be, behaviorally at least, driven by a detection-like signal, right? So the idea here is that you can find conditions where D prime is matched, performance is matched, but you can drive perceptual confidence higher just by adding more signal to the stimulus. So this is known as the positive evidence bias. And what it tells us is that perceptual confidence is not just based on how difficult the decision is objectively on D prime, it's based also on other factors, and one factor is the strength of the overall signal. So one thing that we've done recently, and this is the last study I'll tell you about, this is a study from Matan Mazur, who's a PhD student in my group. What we did was very simply just compare the neural correlates of confidence on a discrimination task with the neural correlates of confidence on a detection task. And so discrimination here was saying whether the stimulus was tilted to the left or to the right. These stimuli are all embedded in noise, so it's difficult to tell what the right answer is. And then you rate your confidence on a sliding scale. You make the circle bigger to say that you're more confident. And we compared that to trials where the setup was very, very similar, but now instead of a discrimination judgment, you're doing a detection judgment. Did you see the stimulus or not? And again, rate your confidence in this decision. And what we were able to do is match performance on the two tasks using staircase procedures. So your accuracy on the discrimination task was not significantly different to accuracy on the detection task. And then we simply looked for correlates of confidence within pre-specified regions of interest. And there's there's other results in the paper, but I'll just focus on the key one for the purposes of this argument. So in this lateral frontopolar region of interest, we see a signal here that correlates with confidence in the detection task, but interestingly doesn't seem to care about confidence in the discrimination task. So this is the bold signal on the y-axis here, confidence on the x-axis. We see this quadratic signature of confidence in the detection task and not much going on for the discrimination task. That's not the case elsewhere. So if we look at, say, medial prefrontal regions, such as the ACC, we see there a fairly consistent signature of confidence across the two different types of tasks. So what this study showed us is that the frontopolar signal, at least in this study, was specific to detection confidence. And that perhaps is what might be, the signal there might be being provided to the system, if you like, that is important for perceptual metacognition. And one way we're thinking about this is within these higher order state space frameworks, where what you need for metacognitive inference about perceptual decision making is some kind of additional layer in the generative model that enables some low dimensional content invariant inference about the presence or absence of perceptual signals. So the presence of this low dimensional detection specific signal in the frontopolar cortex, I think, is interesting. We're thinking about what might be specific about perceptual metacognition that is not necessarily being recruited for metacognition about other domains. Okay, so just to summarize, so we can measure metacognition across different tasks as the statistical association between behavior and self-evaluation or confidence ratings. Adopting a signal detection theory framework allows simultaneous estimation of both first order performance, D prime, and metacognitive sensitivity, or meta D prime, and you'll hear much more about this from Marion in a few minutes. We can see from a variety of angles, variety of perspectives, that confidence appears to be encoded in activation patterns in the prefrontal cortex, independently of changes in behavioral performance. And there's evidence for domain general contributions to metacognition, potentially supported by these more generic task-independent confidence codes in the medial prefrontal cortex. But there's also, I think, interesting hints of domain specificity, and perhaps for linking our understanding of metacognition with our understanding of consciousness, we should focus on these potential domain specificities in perceptual metacognition. And in particular, in recent studies, we've found the frontopolar cortex might be particularly important for perceptual metacognition because it might have this role in low dimensional or abstract tracking of perceptual awareness or detection. So I'll stop there, and yeah, it'd be great to have any questions that people have got.
Great, thanks, Steve, for a very interesting talk. Just wanted to remind people that they can post their questions on the chat. I'm gonna check if there's any at the moment. And while we give people time to think about their questions and write them down, I will take the first question. So Steve, I was wondering about this more perception-specific role of the anterior prefrontal cortex for metacognition. To what extent do you think it might also be related to some role for metacognitive control, as opposed to, because I would presume that perhaps it's a less relevant aspect of memory-related tasks as compared to perception ones. So just wondered if you had any comments on that.
Yeah, so I think that yeah, I'm certainly not saying that this is all that frontopolar cortex is doing, and we know it's more complicated than that. I think you know, from other work, this is from also work that Dan Bang has done. We know that the signal there also seems to track contextual aspects of reports of judgments of confidence in still in a perceptual task, but it tracks to what extent you have to adjust your confidence reports based on the context of that block of trials, for instance. So that would definitely suggest a role for frontopolar cortex in control as well. So yeah, and that makes complete sense. There's also links to work from Etienne Coquelin on the frontopolar cortex, where not focused on metacognition specifically, but within the within the broader tradition of studies on cognitive control, they've shown that the frontal polar cortex seems to be needed to switch to alternative tasks. So I think that, you know, my feeling about what these more anterior frontal regions are doing is that they presumably evolved to have functions that help with behavioral control, but perhaps in the service of doing that, they ended up with coding schemes that are particularly relevant also to aspects of perceptual metacognition that we might think is relevant for consciousness. So there's kind of like that link. I definitely don't expect that the signal there to just be coding for its detection. That would be odd. But perhaps the reason it's doing that is, for instance, a detection-like signal might be important for foraging, or the ability to modulate behavioral control on the basis of detection-like signals. Yeah, totally.
Great. Thanks. We have a couple of questions on the chat now. We have one question from Alejandro asking about whether there's been, that there seems to be a lot of focus on perceptual and memory tasks, and he's wondering about other modalities, whether there's something known about other modalities. Yeah, no, it's a good question. It is mainly, I think, a historical bias. So metacognition research really grew up from out of the memory literature in the 60s and 70s. So a large focus there was on meta memory. And I think then, with the introduction of fairly impactful cognitive psychology papers such as the Nelson and Narron's paper in the 90s, I think there started to be a realization that you could apply the same tools that have been used to study meta memory to other domains in decision making and perception. And so that's really, in the 2000s that started to happen. I mean, obviously, perceptual metacognition, as Matthias mentioned, goes all the way back to the Pearson-Yastrow study. So it's not as if it's been entirely new, but I think there has been a bias towards memory. And then now, you're right. I think that there's these kind of two domains that people have focused on a lot: memory and perception, or memory and perceptual decision making. But now, thankfully, I think we are, as a field, starting to branch out. So people looking at motor metacognition, metacognition of other sensory modalities. Patrick's done nice work in metacognition of pain, for instance. So, there's all these different things to add to the mix. And actually, in that meta-analysis that I put up, there are some studies there of, say, auditory metacognition as well. So it's not just all vision and memory, although historically that has, I think, been the case. Great, thanks. I think we are on time. There's a couple more questions on the chat, but I'll leave it up to you, Steve, whether you want to take another question or move to Marian's talk. Maybe I can answer them in the chat while we switch over, so we remain on time. But yeah. Sounds good. Okay, great. So let's move on then. So Marian, do you want to share your slides?
Yes. Hi. 1 second, sorry. Can you see them?
Yes. Okay. Fantastic. So real pleasure to introduce Marian Rowe, who is at École Normale Supérieure, and Marian was a while ago now, I guess, but used to be a postdoc in my group at UCL, and she's going to tell you more about the measures of metacognition. So take it away, Marian.
Thank you very much, Steve. Thank you, Elizabeth. So I will talk today about measures of metacognition. So you will see that I will bring back some of the studies that Steve has mentioned already, but this time focusing on how the analysis was done and how we can actually quantify different aspects of metacognition. So I would like to thank first Liv Harrison and Steve Fleming, whose work has formed the basis of the current presentation and tutorial that we will run through this afternoon. So daily examples of metacognition include, will I be able to learn this topic? How confident am I in my decision? I can't remember it now, but I know it when I see it. So this time about memory. I'm driving too fast, I feel out of control. This may relate to perceptual or motor decisions. Did I really speak to my partner last night? Or was I dreaming? So as Steve has mentioned already, you see that these statements reflect a number of different cognitive and perceptual domains. And why is it interesting to study metacognition? Of course, there are many different good reasons, but one that I will mention as well today is that there is evidence for inaccurate metacognition of cognitive and physical impairments in a number of psychiatric and neurological disorders, as well as healthy aging. And so that's important to be able to quantify these different changes that can occur across age. And in particular, for many neurological disorders, it's important to have some insight that is a capacity for accurate metacognition and accurate self-evaluation. So we've seen that metacognition can be measured as a confidence report, several subjective confidence judgments. And indeed, confidence variations is a central aspect of many psychiatric pathologies that can take the form of underconfidence or overconfidence in our own judgments or decisions. And so how we go about measuring that? The idea is that we will look at the correspondence between behavior, which we typically would call first-order performance, and metacognitive judgments. So one example of that that's been present in the literature very much is reporting my confidence in getting the answer right. So importantly here, we consider confidence, not in general, but confidence in something, confidence about my decision or about my answer. And the idea is to take this metacognitive judgment, we could apply this to pretty much any task in the blue box here. So that could be a psychophysics experiment, a general knowledge task, an emotion recognition task, and so on. And an important aspect of all the measures that I'm going to present today to quantify metacognition is that it is not possible to assess metacognition from a single judgment, as Steve has said that already, but I want to emphasize that we need typically multiple judgments over time to examine the statistical association between behavior and metacognitive judgments. So it is really about the strength of the correspondence between these two levels, objective performance and subjective confidence report. So here I mentioned performance, but it is to be understood in a very general sense. It's like your cognitive performance or cognitive functioning that we can measure objectively on an experimental task that you will typically do in psychology in the lab. And then for each individual judgment, we will ask participants to give a subjective confidence rating or report in their answer as to how sure they are that they gave a correct response. And from this data, there are two main measures that we can look at that are called metacognitive bias and metacognitive sensitivity. So here on this schematic, what I'm representing is the confidence distributions for correct and incorrect responses separately, plotted on a confidence scale that would go from low confidence to high confidence, if you can see my cursor moving here. So the bias reflects my general tendency to rate my confidence higher or lower, irrespective of fluctuations in my responses. So that's the first dimension, it's just how my general tendency to be confident or unconfident. In contrast, metacognitive sensitivity is about how well I can discriminate between my own correct and incorrect responses. So you can see here that the distribution of confidence judgments are going to be more separated from each other for correct and incorrect decisions. And so the more separated they are, the better the metacognitive sensitivity of the person. So these two measures have been associated with a variety of terminology in the literature for a number of historical reasons. But the notion of confidence level, of confidence bias, self-beliefs is associated to this general tendency to be confident or less confident, irrespective of my performance. Whereas the notion of sensitivity is related to notions of discrimination or resolution, that is how well I can discriminate between my own correct and incorrect decisions. All right. And so another aspect when we do this kind of analysis of the confidence data as a function of correct and incorrect judgment is that we want to take into account what is the actual performance, the first order performance. Because the idea is that if you then observe a difference in metacognitive sensitivity between, say, for instance, two tasks A and B, or two conditions A and B, or two cognitive domains A and B, if you have also a difference in first order performance, it's going to be possibly a spurious difference in metacognition. The idea is that participants' confidence will also reflect some things about differences in first-order performance. In contrast, if you're in a situation as the second one in this cartoon, where the first-order performance is the same across A and B domains or A and B conditions, then you can really interpret your differences in metacognitive sensitivity as a true difference in metacognition. So this aspect is an important focus for the main measures I will present today, meaning that we need methods by which we can really isolate metacognition from fluctuations in first-order performance. So how to measure metacognitive sensitivity then? So we want, in an ideal measure, we should be able to identify differences in metacognitive sensitivity, but that should be unaffected or isolated from metacognitive bias. So my general tendency to be highly confident or not very confident, so the overall confidence bias, and also unaffected by task performance, as we've seen, because otherwise it's difficult to interpret differences in metacognitive sensitivity. And so I will focus today on three main approaches: correlation approaches first, then the area under the type 2 receiving operating curve, and meta-D prime, that's the model that has been developed by Steve and used a lot in his group. And I will present the pros and cons of each of these methods so that you can select what is most relevant to use for your own data and your own specific problems, specific data sets for measuring metacognition. All right, so correlation approaches first. So here we want to measure, as I said, the correspondence between my objective behavior, correct or incorrect, and my confidence reports, which can be high or low. And so one way to measure this correspondence is to simply look at the correlation between decisions that will be, for instance, 1 for correct and 0 for incorrect, and confidence reports. So here we take a very simple situation where we'll just have high or low confidence, but you can explain that for more graded measures. And so that gives you a simple correlation between decisions and confidence. So this measure has some advantages, but it's not bias-free. So it means that it is confounded by fluctuations in performance, as you can see here on this correlation matrix that looks at the relationship between performance and confidence. So it is not so much a problem when you simply want to establish the presence versus the absence of a correlation. But in many other situations, the fact that it's not bias-free will create a confound in your measure. So for correlation measures, basically, one advantage is that it's very simple. You can use it with pretty much any experimental design. You just need to have trials or decisions labeled as correct versus incorrect. And so it's useful if you want to establish the presence versus the absence of metacognition. However, some disadvantages include that it is confounded by fluctuations in performance, so performance on the first order task, by confidence bias, so this is general tendency to rate your confidence higher or lower. And so you want to be careful to match these influences by design if you are then to compare these correlation coefficients, so that can be called phi or gamma between conditions. So we will delve into more detail into the other measures, but first I'm going to show here a study that Steve has mentioned just before about the feeling of knowing in patients with amnesia and Korsakoff syndrome, in which they have observed no difference in task performance between these two groups. And they have applied, for measuring metacognitive sensitivity here, this correlation coefficient. So basically measuring the correlation between participants' performance and their confidence. And that's how they have identified this drop in metacognitive sensitivity. And that is a difference that is interpretable because it is in a context where task performance was matched across the two groups you are comparing. All right, so we will now move on to the second measure that is available for quantifying metacognition, which is the type 2 receiver operating curve. So this is an important methodological advance for quantifying metacognitive ability that has been developed recently. And it is a compact representation of metacognitive sensitivity. So on the right, you can see schematics again. for correct responses on the top and incorrect responses on the bottom about the frequency of each of the confidence ratings that people have reported. So you can see that on average, for correct responses, people will have used more often the highest confidence ratings available, and for incorrect responses, a bit more often the lowest confidence rating. So importantly, in general, the more distinct these confidence distributions for correct and incorrect decisions are, the more insight one has to the quality of the individual decisions. So the higher the metacognitive sensitivity. And so the way we can construct this curve for quantifying metacognitive sensitivity, here the idea is to cumulate the probability of using a particular confidence rating conditional on being correct or incorrect. And then you will plot these cumulative probabilities against each other. So on the vertical axis, you have probability of confidence knowing that you're responding correct. And on the horizontal axis, probability of confidence knowing that you were incorrect. And so the way you build your cumulative distributions here is to compute for all of this level the cumulative probability of using each of these ratings as a function of whether you are correct and incorrect. And you see that here, this is how you obtained this curve that's called type 2 receiver operating curve. And we will look at in more detail during the tutorial on how we can quantify and plot this curve. And the idea is then to look at the area under the curve for measuring how sensitive you are. So how separated these two distributions will be. So here you can see that on the right, there is a degree of metacognitive sensitivity. People did not respond similarly their confidence for correct and incorrect responses. But now, in contrast, if we look at an example where there would be no metacognition, so you can see here very similar distributions for correct and incorrect decisions. Then if I construct with you the type 2 receiver operating curve, you can see that here we'll get a purely diagonal curve. So here, there is no difference in the frequency of use of each of these confidence ratings as a function of whether I was correct or incorrect. And this is a reflection of a lack of metacognitive sensitivity. Therefore, when looking, if you compare this curve to the one before, you can see that the more curvy the curve is, the higher the metacognitive sensitivity. So I will show here in more detail that, so first to summarize, so this is a simple measure of metacognitive sensitivity in the sense of here you are really just replotting your confidence data as a function of correct or incorrect. And in theory, it is independent of metacognitive bias. So the tendency of people to use this if they have shifts in the way they use the scale or differences in overall confidence. But you can see that it's not dependent or independent of first order performance. So in simulations here for different types of type 1 performance, you see that it has an effect on how far from the diagonal the curve is, and therefore on the metacognitive sensitivity that you measure. So to summarize the pros and cons of the second approach, whether you should use this type 2 area under the curve. So one advantage is that it is a non-parametric measure of sensitivity. Again, that can be used with pretty much any design for which you can define correct and incorrect responses. You don't have anything to fit here. You're really just calculating cumulative probabilities from your response and confidence data. It is independent of metacognitive bias in most contexts. However, you can have confounds from first order performance, as we've seen in the previous slides. It is also effective by response criterion. So I haven't presented here how that happens. It's usually not a major issue in experimental design, but if you have biases in the first order response criterion, that can also affect the type 2 area under the curve. And again, as for the correlation coefficients we've seen before, it needs a performance control design or to control for performance in your analysis. For instance, if you do multiple regression, you can include performance as well to remove the variance associated with fluctuations in performance and focus on metacognition alone. But ideally, as always, it's better if you have controlled for it beforehand in the first place, that is in your actual experimental design or protocol. An empirical example that you've seen already presented today by Steve, in which this type 2 area under the curve has been used, is in the study of perceptual metacognition. And importantly, this is indeed a situation in which it was critical to isolate metacognition from fluctuations in performance. And that was done nicely by Steve by using psychophysical techniques, such as the staircase procedure here, to do that. So in blue, you can see the triangles indicating that indeed participants achieved a comparable performance, which allows us to really interpret these differences in area under the curve as reflecting their metacognitive sensitivity on the task. And by doing that, as you've seen, the anterior prefrontal cortex area was identified as correlating and reflecting this metacognitive ability as measured by this type 2 area under the curve parameter. Okay, I'm just checking the time. And so we'll now move on to the third measure of focus for today, which is called meta-D prime, as based on signal detection theory D prime initially. So a typical setting for applying this method is when you have a stimulus triggering a response. And as we've seen before, a confidence rating or report that people subjectively provide about their response. And meta-D prime is a way, another way to quantify metacognitive sensitivity that is inspired or extended, if you want, from the way we quantify first-order sensitivity for actual responses in signal detection theory. So the core idea behind the meta-D prime approach is that there is, so I'll present the confidence data on top of this. So this curve represents the actual evidence you would have for either response A or response B. And C is your first order criterion for responding response A or response B as function of the evidence you've seen. And the core idea behind this meta-D prime approach is that there is single theoretical type 2 receiving operating curve, as we've seen before, that is completely determined by particular signal detection theory model with parameters D prime, so that's your first order sensitivity, criterion, and the confidence criteria that we call C2 here. And so the fitting of meta-D prime rests on calculating what is the likelihood of observing your confidence rating data, given that you have this particular type 2 receiving operating curve that is generated by systematic variations of this D prime and criterion parameters and type 2 criterion parameters. So I will enter a bit more in more detail in this model. So it is different from the previous measures in the sense that it's not just a way of replotting your data. If you want, it's really a generative model by which you're trying to explain what would produce the observed confidence distributions that you have in your data. So you can see these vertical lines representing the type 2 confidence criteria that determine thresholds, if you want, by which below or above that threshold, I will respond with high or low confidence. And here I'm representing a binary situation with just 2 confidence ratings, but we could, and we will extend this model with a number of possible confidence ratings you can use on a discrete scale. And then you will have a series of type 2 criterion for thresholding your confidence along the scale. Okay. And so you can see the type 2 receiving operating curve here on the top. And the core idea, again, behind this approach is to find a set of parameters, D prime criteria and criteria 2, that best fits participants' type 2 receiving operating curve that you can see in your data. That's your observation. And the area under each segment of the curve gives you probability of using each of the confidence levels. Okay, so we will come back to that as well in the tutorial, but I want to already give you a brief sense of how this works. And I will not go too far into the details, as I want to make sure that there is plenty of time also to show you some data. But you can see here, so on the top, you have observed confidence distributions, again, plotted separately for correct and incorrect decisions on a confidence scale that goes from low to high. And here we have the meta D prime, which is fitted to this area under the curve, compared to the observed D prime. And you can see that in these two bottom curves, the distribution of confidence rating simulated for a similar value of D prime, so similar first order performance, and different values of meta D prime. And you can see on the right plot that for a smaller value of meta D prime, the confidence distributions for correct and incorrect decisions are closer together, are less discriminated, which reflects a lower level of metacognitive sensitivity. Here there is Gaussian noise added to confidence rating, so we will come back to that in the tutorial. The idea that participants do not have a perfect readout of their confidence from the evidence when they report on this subjective scale. And then I will move on to a bit of terminology, which is metacognitive efficiency that represents the ratio of meta D prime over D prime, so metacognitive parameter, as a function of your first order sensitivity parameters. So it reflects how well you can extract metacognitive information given that particular level of first order sensitivity that you already have in your first order data. So to recap, this taxonomy of metacognitive measures that have been sometimes labeled with different terminology, but that are now quite widespread, accepted in the literature. So metacognitive bias of confidence or confidence level or confidence bias reflect your changes in confidence despite a level of matched performance. So that really, as we were saying before, reflects your tendency to rate your confidence higher or lower on a scale for a given level of matched performance. Then we have metacognitive sensitivity, which reflects how closely your confidence rating actually discriminates between your correct and incorrect judgments. And that's what reflects in the two first measures we've seen, confidence performance correlations, and type 2 receiving operating. Then we have metacognitive efficiency, which reflects the subject metacognitive capacity between given a particular level of task performance. That you take into account what is already the level of first order performance. And that's important because the information you will extract for reporting your confidence will be limited or at least based or taken into account what was your first order performance. So as we've seen for the two previous measures, you have pros and cons in using the meta D prime approach. An advantage as compared to previous measures is that it provides a principal metric for metacognitive sensitivity in a generative model. So again, the core idea is that you are trying to find and estimate the parameters that would produce this particular distribution of confidence rating given your responses. So it's not only analyzing the observed data you have, but taking into account this generative model. And that way you take into account both type 1 related to performance and type 2 biases. And the meta D prime metric you get is in units of type 1 D prime, which makes it easier to control for performance by looking at this meta D prime over D prime ratio, and so give you a global metric of metacognitive efficiency. Some cons now. So the measure is currently only developed for two-choice discrimination tasks. So we will see in the tutorial applied to similar two-choice discrimination tasks. So you will need to extend it to, we can't accommodate now studies that have more than two choices, but a lot of the literature so far have rested on characterizing already this kind of decision tasks. There are assumptions, so I haven't talked about it so much, of equal variance Gaussian assumption that may not hold for some tasks. So it's important to check this kind of assumption in the way your stimulus or evidence quantity is distributed in your, discrimination task. And you can sometimes have biased estimates with low trial number. So we will look at that in more details in the tutorial. So this will, it's an important point because we always have participants not doing an infinite number of trials. So we're limited by the data we have. We have a sample of decisions. And in particular, if you test participants who are of older age or who have neurological or psychiatric difficulties, you would typically get smaller number of trials, smaller sample. And therefore, you want to choose a method that can accommodate for these particular constraints in your dataset. So one way to solve that problem has been introduced a couple of years ago. That's work developed by Steve, which is a hierarchical meta-D-prime toolbox that I will show. One of the advantages that it provides is that the generative model is estimated in different ways, and it will help you accommodate low trial number in particular. So we'll go. But first, to give you a bit more about what's the theory behind, it has been introduced to solve a number of problems or limitations from the original meta-D-prime approach. The idea with the meta-D-prime approach is that you get point estimates of meta-D-prime, so you get a single value for a particular condition of participants. That may be noisy because you have a small number of trials, you have only tested your participants for a certain amount of time. And therefore, you have a limited number of confidence rating and frequencies estimates of hit and rates and false alarm rates. But you don't have a measure of precision or uncertainty around those, the meta-D-prime estimates. And that can be important to take into account, which is knowing the reliability of your estimation. Then a hierarchical Bayesian approach is the correct way to combine information about within and between subject uncertainty, with each participant mutually constraining the group fit. So here we've talked about how we have uncertainty because we have only a limited number of trials per participant. And we have also between subject and test uncertainty because we can't test an infinite number of participants. And the way the hierarchical approach works is that it takes into account both types of uncertainty at the same time, and therefore will give you more reliable estimates, or at least taking into account the sample group you have. And we will see later how each participant mutually constrain the group estimates. So that's important if you have, for instance, outlier participants who have used the confidence scale very differently from other people that may otherwise influence or have particular outlier values for meta-D-prime. So when you feed the initial meta-D-prime model, signal detection theory models to data, you sometimes have to do padding or edge correction to avoid zero cell counts when no all types of responses are present. So what I mean by here is that you may have a participant who do not use all possible confidence ratings on the scale for all their correct and incorrect decisions. And so you may have empty situations or empty counts. And the model won't be able to accommodate for that. So you would typically have very small number of trials in each cells for correcting this problem. But in doing that, you will create small biases in the data, which you don't need to do in the hierarchical approach because you have a generative multinomial model to avoid this issue. Finally, it is more straightforward to test group level hypotheses. For instance, directly compare distribution over metacognitive sensitivity for two groups of participants, or for two tasks, for two domains, comparing metacognitive sensitivity between patients and controls, because you will have knowledge of the uncertainty around estimates for each of your two groups. So in the tutorial we'll do this afternoon, there will be an example of how this group comparison can take place. So here is the generative model. So I perhaps won't enter too much into the mathematical details here, but you have in gray what is your observation of confidence rating that you have in your data. You have the meta-D-prime model that is our focus. So first, inside the box, we have parameters that are defined at the level of the participants. And outside of the box, we have prior or meta-prior estimates, if you want. We have criterion from stimulus 1 and stimulus 2 responses. We have type 2 criterion. Okay, so these are the priors. And one important difference with the original meta-D-prime is that this time we'll do a direct estimation of this ratio of meta-D-prime over D-prime. That's the quantity we want to optimize, instead of optimizing meta-D-prime alone and taking D-prime for the data. So this is interesting because you have a model that fully takes into account both the response part and the metacognitive part. So here you have a number of priors that are redundant with each other to accommodate some mathematical details. So perhaps I won't enter to that right now, but I'm happy to take questions if you have later. And so this is the distributions that specify each of the parameters that you're going to optimize. Okay, and so what you get at the end, and that we will go through during the tutorial this afternoon, is that you have all of your samples of your group level metacognitive efficiency, because here we optimize directly the ratio, so directly metacognitive efficiency. So this is important to plot your samples, because if you have this kind of crazy caterpillar, it means that you don't have autocorrelation or systematic biases or trends in your estimation, which would provide biased metacognitive estimates. So the first one is a sanity check. Then the interesting part is the second one here, where you would plot the distribution of your samples to get an idea of what's the meta d prime over d prime value in your group. And interestingly, you have this Gaussian curve indicating that you have a sense of the precision or uncertainty over your value. And then in panel B, you have a plot of what we call parameter recovery, which is showing that the fitted value you get from this procedure correlate with the generative values you have. And that's important because it indicates that there is no systematic fit or deviations from what you would expect estimation. And another advantages of the approach here. So first, to explain what we are looking at, is estimation of this meta d prime over d prime ratio as a function of a number of parameters in the model, d prime, type 2 criterion for my confidence, and plotted on the horizontal axis as a function of a number of trials for previous methods in yellow and red, and for the hierarchical methods. And importantly here, you can see that you can observe sometimes deviations from the actual value for previous method of estimation. And that occurs in particular when you have a low number of trials, where you can see that the hierarchical approach corrects for that and is less deviated than the previous methods. So the point estimate approaches, the original ones, underestimate metacognitive efficiency when type 1 d prime is low. So that's this 0.5 here in this example. There are reasons why this works better with the hierarchical approach. So we will go through that in the tutorial with examples, but the idea is that because you fit all of your participants together, you may have a shrinkage of value towards your prior or capitalize on the hierarchy across subjects, meaning that outlier participants will be taken into account because everyone is fitted at the same time. So that's the second explanation, sorry. The first one is that you have a shrinkage towards the prior value that you specify for your estimate. Okay, so these are also a number of simulations from the paper. For this time, different metacognitive value. So we'll go through this right now, and we can look more at the summary plot, which shows the deviation. So basically, here's the false positive rate. And you can see that the hierarchical model does a very good job at having correct estimates for even a low number of trials, up to 50 trials. And then when you have experiments in the range of hundreds of trials, this is much less of an issue. And to finish with, I would like to go back to the empirical example that Steve has given before in his lecture, in which he and his co-workers have compared ability in a group of patients who had lesion overlapping with Brodmann area 10, so this anterior prefrontal cortex. So this is a figure that shows the overlap of the lesions. And to remind you what was the experiment about, is that patients and controls were asked to carry out two decision-making tasks with confidence ratings given after each decision. And the second one is a simple two alternative forced choice task in which you have to do a word recognition task. So people had to memorize a list and then were asked which of the two words was present in the previous list. And following each recognition decision, they would give a confidence rating. And so from this decision, it's possible to calculate their D prime, and from their confidence rating, their level of metacognitive ability in each domain. So you've seen this graph before, right? So this is the performance correct in each of the three groups. and as well as the confidence that shows no difference. So that's very important because we are in a situation that allows us to apply this meta-D' framework because we have no difference in first order performance between all of the patients. And I'm going to focus on perception only here as a measure of insight. So this is the initial meta-D' over D' value. So that's the method 3 we've seen today that has served here to quantify metacognitive ability. And the observation was that there was a selective decrease in metacognitive ability in the perceptual task in this group of participants with lesions in the anterior prefrontal cortex. And that was a decrease as compared to both the other groups. And because we are in a situation in which we can apply this hierarchical meta-D' model, so there was no difference in memory. Sorry, so that was more about the interpretation. I want to focus on the methods for today. And basically what Steve did is reanalyzing this perceptual confidence data, but this time using the hierarchical approach. So instead of having only a point estimate for each of the tasks and groups, here we have a distribution over this meta-D' over D' ratio. And you can see the healthy controls in gray, the participants with anterior frontal lesions in pink. And you can see that indeed we replicate a difference with a lower metacognitive performance, a lower insight in participants with lesions in this task. And what's interesting is that using this hierarchical approach, you can directly compare a group difference. So here you cannot use regular frequency statistics, but you can use Bayesian statistics to directly compare and estimate the difference between patients and controls. And you can plot this difference here. The fact that it's significantly different, above 0, means that there is a true difference between these two groups. So in the tutorial this afternoon, we will go through an example of that. And so this approach can be used to compare many different metacognitive situations. So I have 2 final slides to show you other examples of how these methods were applied. One is in computational psychiatry. So there was a comparison of metacognitive efficiency in a perceptual task in individuals with high or low compulsivity. And Toby Hauser in the study was able to identify a significant difference in metacognitive efficiency between these 2 groups of participants. Similarly, together with Steve, we've run a study looking at many different types of psychiatric symptoms that people reported on scales. And we could identify by applying these methods. Again, you can see there was no difference in accuracy, whatever your score on the symptom, different symptom dimensions. But we could identify that participants who had stronger anxious depression symptoms had a better metacognitive efficiency. So they were actually more accurate at judging their correct and their incorrect decisions. Whereas participants who had more symptoms of compulsivity and intrusive thoughts had overconfidence, but they had a lower metacognitive efficiency. So they were less good at discriminating their own correct and incorrect judgment. So finally, to take home, between the 3 methods we've seen today, correlation, type 2 area under the curve, and meta-D', there is not one method systematically better than the other for measuring metacognition, but you really have to bear in mind what are the pros and cons to find the most reliable one for your current data set. From the nature of your empirical data, and this is currently an active area of research. So in particular, there is a continuous refinement of fitting techniques that make it more and more reliable. And to anticipate a little bit on what we'll do this afternoon, so I've recapped the steps here, where we'll first go through MATLAB and
suggest that we maybe leave this until after the lunch break, and then you can start with this.
That.
Yeah, because I just want to make sure there's time for questions because we've got a break for lunch at past.
Of course.
That was fantastic.
Thank you
so much. That was really excellent. So thanks, Marion. But yeah, it'd be great to start on those slides with the tutorial for.
Sure.
So there's questions in the chat. So I think we have time for doing 2 or 3 of these, and then maybe we can answer the ones we don't get to directly in the chat. Let's see. So, sorry. So Nicholas is asking, do we know of any examples where people have actually used regression to control for D prime in area under the curve analyses?
I think so. So I can send out a few papers in the chat box in which I've seen this approach. So the idea is that you would basically put into your regression everything that you think may matter for a metacognitive sensitivity. So it can be the difficulty of the stimulus you have, people actual performance, so a percent correct or a D prime, and sometimes a number of regressors of no interest. And therefore you can look at what best explains the variance in metacognitive sensitivity using the type 2 ROC curve. So I don't have them on top of my head, but I'm happy to send them in the chat later.
That's great. That's great. And then, so Yaya is asking, thanks for the great talk. What do you think about measuring metacognition with logistic regression if performance is controlled?
So indeed, controlling for performance seems to be quite a central aspect when we do this comparison between groups. I'm not sure what you had in mind. Perhaps if you can unpack a little bit your question, what would be the logistic regression about? So do you want to predict performance for a number of things? Or do you want to predict confidence? And then a logistic regression would work only if your dependent variable is binary. So if you have high and low confidence, maybe you want to predict that. But as long as you have a more graded or continuous measure of confidence, I'm not so sure how you could set that up.
So I think, if I'm interpreting the question correct, I think it refers to, there are some measures out there that are predicting, that are using logistic regression where the binary variable is accuracy, so correct or incorrect. Yeah, so you're nodding. Yes. Yeah, exactly, as a function of confidence. So I think that, I mean, our feeling on this is that it's very similar to the correlation measures, right? So effectively what you're doing there is using a regression technique to correlate accuracy with confidence, but using a slightly different link function than Pearson correlation. So I think all the things that Marion said about correlation would apply to logistic regression. Yeah.
I see. Indeed, if it's only confidence that predicts accuracy, it would work that way. Yeah.
And then maybe let's take one last question. So Astrid says, Astrid asks, could you elaborate on reasons to focus on meta D prime over D prime instead of just meta D prime?
Yes. So the idea, and maybe Steve will correct me if I'm wrong, is that when you focus on the group level, you kind of treat D prime for each participant as a nuisance parameter. So it means that then the group level influence is carried out directly on metacognitive efficiency rather than on meta D prime alone. So that's the advantage of this approach. You kind of take them into account together. Do you want to add something, Steve, maybe to that?
No, I totally agree. I think that's exactly right. So the general idea with efficiency is that you're taking D prime as a nuisance parameter, that even if you've controlled it in some way, it might still vary from subject to subject subtly. I think on a conceptual level, it depends on your goal. So you sometimes find papers in the comparative literature, so comparing like animal and animal metacognition, for instance. And if your goal there, or say metacognition in babies or infants, if your goal is literally to say there is metacognition versus there isn't, then meta D prime is probably enough, because it doesn't matter what the performance is. Right? If your goal is to compare across subjects or across conditions or across species, maybe then you probably want to care about D prime. And as Marion says, enter it as a nuisance parameter.
Yeah, you're right. It depends on how precisely you want to quantify it as compared to just say there is, there isn't, or there is different, there is no difference for what's the purpose of your current study.
Yeah. Okay, cool. So I think we're 2 minutes over. So I think everyone, we need to treat our lunch breaks as sacrosanct. So we will take it as a full lunch break. So thanks again, Marion, for a lovely talk.
Thank you.
Very clear. So we'll come back, Elizabeth, is it quarter past one, isn't it? And then we'll kick off with Marion. Maybe if you could just give those last few slides on the tutorial, and we'll go from there.
Perfect.
Okay.
Thank you, everyone.